Welcome, deep divers, to another journey into the fascinating and, well, often bizarre corners of human history and behavior.
Great to be diving in again.
So today, we're tackling something truly peculiar, but I think profoundly insightful. Close your eyes for a second and just picture this. A dusty field, two soldiers, weapons ready, glaring at each other, all because someone, allegedly, stole a wooden pail, just a bucket.
Right. Or maybe picture a modern naval captain, red in the face, arguing over fishing lines, pushing things so far that a whole nation is threatening to quit NATO.
Exactly. It sounds almost, comical, doesn't it? Like something out of a satire.
It really does. But these aren't jokes.
Not at all. These are real moments in history where something seemingly tiny, trivial even, ignited, extraordinary state action, and sometimes, tragically, actual bloodshed.
And that absurdity, that surface-level strangeness, is actually key.
That's precisely the point we want to dig into today. We're embarking on a deep dive into what we're calling the world's strangest wars. And our mission here isn't just to recount funny stories. It's to peel back the layers, move beyond those bizarre headlines, and really uncover the deeper stuff, the political, the economic, the psychological forces that were truly at play.
Because these stories, they're often shortcuts, aren't they, to understanding how small incidents can escalate in massive ways.
Totally. They're witty, dark, often both at the same time. And honestly, I think they teach us more about human behavior and state action than maybe some of the big, quote-unquote, grand wars. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Well, what's fascinating here, as you said, is how these triggers, they look ludicrous on the surface, right? A pig, a bucket.
Right.
But when you look closer, they become these perfect illustrations of the tensions simmering underneath. They're not just, historical quirks. They're really vivid windows into these complex systems of power, identity, ambition, things that are still shaping our world right now.
Definitely. And to really get a handle on this, we need to be clear about what we mean by strange. We're absolutely not saying lives weren't at stake.
No, not at all. The human cost was often very real. Tragically so.
The strangeness comes purely from the immediate trigger, the spark. It being unusually trivial or, bizarre. We're talking about conflicts that appeared to be kicked off by things like a pig rooting in a garden.
Or a stolen wooden bucket, yeah.
A claim over some ruined pastries, an entire army versus flightless birds.
Emus, yes. Yeah. Fishing nets. Even a football match.
Right. Things that just don't seem proportional to mobilizing armies or navies.
Exactly. And the key insight for you listening is that these trivial triggers, they are almost never the real fundamental cause of the war.
Okay. So they're more like pretexts.
Pretexts, flashpoints, convenient excuses, you could say.
Yeah.
The deeper stuff, the politics, the economics, the cultural friction that's doing the real work under the surface, it's priming the pump for conflict.
Okay.
It's a great analogy for this. The pig or the bucket wasn't the tinder, the dry stuff ready to burn. It was just the flint.
The spark that ignites it.
Precisely. Just the spark. The tinder, the border disputes, the economic stress, the national pride that was already there, piled up, just waiting. And that's a crucial distinction, you see, because even today we see this. A single incident, maybe a viral video, can ignite huge unrest or diplomatic crises. And we often focus so much on the spark, the immediate thing, that we miss the fact that the tinder was dry and ready for ages.
That's a really powerful way to put it, the flint, not the tinder. Okay, so armed with that understanding, let's take that whistle-stop tour through some of history's most peculiar conflicts. This is where it gets really interesting, seeing the sheer range of these things.
Yeah, the variety is quite something.
Okay, first up, let's dive into one that often gets a chuckle, but had, incredibly serious potential consequences. The Pig War. San Juan Islands, 1859.
Ah, yes, the pig.
So the spark here, unbelievably mundane. You have this American settler, Lyman Cutler.
From Ohio, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think so. He finds this pig, a large black pig, rooting around in his potato patch on San Juan Island. Not for the first time, apparently. He's fed up, so he shoots it.
Okay. Problem solved.
Not quite, because this wasn't just any pig. It belonged to a guy named Charles Griffin, who worked for the British-owned Hudson's Bay Company. And a pig back then, on the frontier, that was valuable livestock.
Right. A real asset.
So Griffin is furious. Demands $100 in damages, which was a huge amount of money then. Cutler offers $10, basically saying, your pig was trespassing, and boom, it escalates fast.
And this is where the tinder comes in, right? The pig itself wasn't the core issue.
Exactly. It became the symbol. The real issue was the San Juan Islands themselves. Strategically vital land claimed by both the U.S. and Great Britain. The Oregon Treaty of 1846. It completely fumbled the maritime border definition.
Yeah, it mentioned the farthest channel separating the mainland from Vancouver Island, but didn't specify which channel. There were two plausible ones.
Right. And depending on which channel you picked, the islands went to either the US or Britain. Total ambiguity.
So Cutler shooting Griffin's pig wasn't just about potatoes anymore. It was instantly a sovereignty issue. An American killing British property on disputed land.
And it blew up. Within days, you have U.S. troops landing on the island, led by Captain George Pickett. Yeah, that Pickett from Gettysburg later on.
Sent by General Harney, wasn't he? Known for being pretty anti-British, he probably saw his chance.
Definitely seems like it. And then, boom, the British Royal Navy shows up. Multiple warships, cannons pointed.
So you have soldiers, warships, cannons, all lined up over a dead pig on an island with a fuzzy border.
For months, they were in this tense standoff, building fortifications, writing formal, angry letters back and forth. But here's the amazing part. Despite all that firepower, nobody actually shot anyone. No human casualties.
Remarkable, really. A testament perhaps to some restraint on the ground, or maybe just luck. Rear Admiral Baines on the British side apparently refused orders to escalate, saying he wouldn't involve two great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig.
Wow. So the deeper causes were clear. Those ambiguous maps, the overlapping legal claims, that raw national and imperial pride, and the resolution. It took decades. Eventually, German Emperor Wilhelm the Light arbitrated.
And awarded the islands to the U.S., yeah. But think about that standoff. Months of tension, two global powers on the brink, triggered by a farmer's dispute over damages for a pig. It just perfectly illustrates how a tiny local grievance, when it taps into those bigger structural issues like borders and pride, can become a massive international crisis, almost overnight.
It really is mind-boggling. Okay, from pigs in the 19th century, let's jump way back. Back to 1325, medieval Italy, the War of the Oaken Bucket.
Ah, another classic of the genre, Molina versus Bologna.
So the spark here, get this. Some Modenese soldiers sneak into Bologna territory during a night raid. And what strategic target do they hit? They steal a wooden bucket.
Just a regular bucket from a public well.
Yep, from a well just outside the San Felice Gate in Bologna. It wasn't military strategy. It seems like it was just bravado, a prank, a way to thumb their nose at their rivals in Bologna.
Okay, so like medieval trash talk, but with theft.
Pretty much. Bologna obviously is furious. Give us back our bucket. They demand it back. In Modena, they basically say, nope. Finders keepers with a lot of swagger.
Now again, this seems utterly ridiculous. Why go to war over a bucket? But we have to put ourselves in their shoes.
Exactly. This wasn't just medieval silliness. For these fiercely proud, independent Italian city-states, honor was everything. An insult, even over a bucket, wasn't just an insult. It was an attack on their city's identity, its prestige, its very standing.
And these cities were already locked in intense rivalries, weren't they? The whole Guelph versus Ghibelline thing, pro-Pope versus pro-Holy Roman Emperor factions. Modena was generally Ghibelline and Bologna generally Guelph. So the bucket theft landed right on those existing fault lines.
So losing the bucket, or failing to get it back, wasn't just embarrassing. It was a profound loss of face, a public humiliation that could signal weakness to enemies and allies alike. It challenged Bologna's dignity.
And that perceived slight was enough. It escalated from a demand for the bucket's return to a full-blown military mobilization. This led to the Battle of Zappolino.
And this wasn't a small skirmish, right?
Not at all. We're talking tens of thousands of soldiers involved. Pitched battle. And hundreds, maybe even a couple thousand died, all stemming, ultimately, from that stolen bucket.
It's staggering. And the punchline?
The punchline is that the bucket, or at least a bucket claimed to be the original, is still around. It's displayed in Modena City Hall in the Torre della Ghirlandina as a trophy.
Wow. A museum piece born from a deadly conflict over civic pride and, well, a pail.
It just shows how deeply ingrained those cultural values, honor, reputation, civic pride could outweigh the material costs, the human costs of war.
Yeah.
And, maybe they still do, in different ways today.
A bucket, a pig. Okay, let's switch continents and species. Australia, 1932. The Emu War.
Right. Not technically a war between nations, but definitely a strange conflict between humans and, well, birds.
And this wasn't just like pigeons being annoying. This was a genuine crisis for farmers in Western Australia. They were facing devastating crop damage from huge migrating flocks of emus.
And emus are not small birds. They're huge, powerful, flightless, can run incredibly fast. Imagine 20,000 of them descending on your wheat fields.
Yeah, especially during the Great Depression when farmers were already struggling. These weren't just any farmers either. Many were World War I veterans settled on marginal land. They were desperate.
So they appealed to the government, specifically the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce. Yeah. And the government decided to send in the army.
With machine guns.
Yep, Lewis automatic machine guns, under the command of a Major Meredith. The plan was essentially military pest control on a grand scale.
How did that go?
About as well as you'd expect trying to machine gun thousands of fast, erratic birds in open country. It was a fiasco.
They just couldn't hit them.
Pretty much. The emus were too fast. They scattered in unpredictable ways. They were surprisingly resilient even when hit. The soldiers used thousands of rounds of ammunition for very few kills, maybe a few hundred out of the estimated 20,000 birds. The campaign was called off, then briefly restarted, then abandoned again.
So a total failure, and probably pretty embarrassing for the military.
Hugely embarrassing. It made headlines around the world, mostly mocking ones. But beyond the humor, what's really interesting is seeing it as a state policy response. It shows the limits of using conventional military tactics against, well, an unconventional enemy, and it really highlights the political pressures of agricultural distress. The government was trying to do something for these struggling farmers.
Even if that something was sending machine gunners after birds.
Exactly. It was an attempt, however misguided or impractical, to solve a real economic problem. The public mockery just underscored that massive gap between the political intention and the rather challenging reality on the ground.
Okay, from elusive birds to a very, very brief but decisive conflict. Let's go to 1896, Zanzibar. The Anglo-Zanzibar War, famously the shortest war in history.
Right. Depending on how you count, maybe 38 to 45 minutes.
So what was the spark here? A succession dispute, wasn't it?
Precisely. The pro-British Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini died suddenly, maybe suspiciously, maybe not. And almost immediately, his nephew, Khalid bin Bargash, seized the palace and declared himself the new sultan.
Which the British didn't like.
Not at all. They had their own preferred candidate, Hamud bin Mohammed, who they knew would be much more compliant with British interests in the region. Zanzibar was strategically important.
So Britain says step down, Khalid says no. Then what?
Then the British consul, Basil Cave, delivers an ultimatum. Be out of the palace by 9 a.m. the next day, August 27th, or face the consequences. Khalid refuses. He gathers several thousand supporters, some cannons, even an armed yacht in the harbor. He thinks he can resist.
He thought wrong.
Very wrong. The British response was overwhelming and pre-planned. At precisely 9:00 a.m., 5 Royal Navy warships anchored in the harbor opened fire.
Just unleashed everything.
Total bombardment. The palace was heavily damaged, set ablaze. Khalid's cannons were silenced. His armed yacht was sunk. His forces scattered. The whole thing was over in under 45 minutes.
Wow. And Khalid?
He fled to the German consulate for asylum. The British installed their preferred sultan, Hamud, almost immediately. End of story. Shortest war ever.
It's just such a stark example of raw imperial power, isn't it?
Absolutely. This incident perfectly shows how huge power imbalances completely change the game. A political disagreement, a succession dispute that in other contexts might take weeks of negotiation becomes instant, fatal violence. The trigger was succession, yes, but the underlying tinder was that massive power differential and Britain's absolute determination to maintain control. It wasn't really a war in the sense of a contest. It was a swift, brutal enforcement action. A demonstration.
A very short, very violent demonstration. And these aren't even all the examples, are they? There are others that fit this pattern.
Oh, definitely. You mentioned the Pastry War earlier. France versus Mexico, 1838-39.
Right, sparked by claims for damages, including famously from a French pastry chef whose shop got looted during some unrest in Mexico City.
Exactly. Monsieur Rolantel claimed 60,000 pesos, which was astronomical. But France used his claim, and others, as a pretext.
A pretext for what?
For gunboat diplomacy. To collect debts, exert influence, maybe gain some concessions. They sent a fleet, blockaded Mexican ports, even bombarded the fortress at Veracruz. It went on for months, cost lives, damaged the Mexican economy.
Until the British helped negotiate a settlement. So again, a seemingly small, almost absurd claim of pastries becomes the excuse for major military intervention.
Classic 19th century power politics. Then you have the Cod Wars, UK versus Iceland. Much more recent, 1950s through the 70s.
Not really a war with shooting, but definitely a conflict. Overfish.
Overfishing rights, specifically. Iceland kept expanding its exclusive fishing zone, pushing British trawlers out of waters they'd fished for centuries. Iceland's economy utterly depended on fish.
So what happened? Ramming ships? Cutting nets?
All of that.
Yeah.
Icelandic Coast Guard vessels harassing British trawlers, Royal Navy frigates deployed to protect them. Lots of tense encounters, collisions, nets cut. It even strained NATO because both countries were members. Iceland actually threatened to leave NATO over it.
Wow, over codfish.
It sounds trivial, but for Iceland, it was national survival. For the UK, it was about established rights and a significant industry. It shows how vital economic resources can lead to sustained, aggressive, even dangerous confrontations, even without outright warfare. Ultimately, Iceland largely got its way.
And then the one that sounds like it came straight from a satirical newspaper.
Yeah.
The Football War.
Yeah.
1969, El Salvador versus Honduras.
Yeah, the soccer war. Triggered literally by riots and violence around a 3-game World Cup qualifying playoff between the two countries.
El Salvador won the decisive third match, right? And then things exploded.
Exploded is the right word. There were attacks on Salvadoran fans in Honduras after the second game, and then retaliatory attacks in El Salvador. But critically, there was widespread violence against the large population of Salvadoran immigrants living in Honduras. Nationalism whipped up by the games just ignited pre-existing tensions.
So the football wasn't the cause.
Not at all. It was the spark, the catalyst, the magnifying glass, as you said earlier. The real issues, the tinder, were much deeper. Land scarcity in crowded El Salvador, pushing hundreds of thousands of peasants to migrate into less populated Honduras over decades. Resentment in Honduras over land ownership, jobs, border disputes, economic inequality, political instability.
All that simmering beneath the surface.
Exactly. So when the football rivalry boiled over, it tapped into all that. El Salvador launched air raids and a ground invasion into Honduras. The war lasted about 100 hours. Thousands were killed or wounded. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans were displaced or fled Honduras.
100 hours, but devastating consequences, all ignited by a game.
Or rather, ignited by the context surrounding the game. These examples, from the pig to the pastries to the football, they really hammer home that point. The trivial trigger is almost always just the surface layer. To really get it, we need to go deeper. What are the underlying human drivers? The psychological stuff, the social dynamics.
Right, because beneath the absurdity, there seem to be these repeating patterns in human behavior, don't there? Let's dive into those hidden springs.
Absolutely. This is where we move from the what to the why.
Okay, first big one. Scapegoating, diversion, and symbolic targets. It feels like sometimes these trivial incidents are almost convenient.
They absolutely can be. This is a really powerful dynamic. The idea is that leaders or powerful groups sometimes deliberately redirect public anger away from tricky internal problems like economic hardship or social tensions, maybe political failures.
So instead of dealing with the real problem, find an easy external enemy.
Precisely. Point the finger outwards. In social psychology, they call it scapegoat theory. Frustration and aggression get displaced onto an easily identifiable, often vulnerable target. It could be a minority group, or even an object like that bucket, or maybe the actions of another nation represented by, say, a pig.
Okay. And politically.
Political science has the diversionary theory of war. This suggests leaders facing internal crises, maybe falling approval ratings, economic downturns might actually manufacture or exaggerate an external conflict. Why? To rally people around the flag, boost national unity, and distract everyone from the problems at home. Wag the dog, as they say.
So these theories help explain how a minor incident gets blown way out of proportion. It's deliberately amplified.
It can be, yeah. The incident itself isn't the source of the public's anger, but it becomes the lightning rod. It's a way for leaders to simplify complex issues. The problem isn't our economic policy. The problem is them stealing our bucket, letting their pig trespass. It externalizes blame.
Okay, let's apply that to the pig war. You said General Harney was quite anti-British and maybe saw an opportunity. How did the pig become such a useful symbol for him or for others wanting to assert U.S. claims?
Well, the pig was perfect, in a way. It was tangible. It was there. It wasn't some abstract borderline on a map. It was a dead animal in a potato patch. It immediately created a victim, Cutler, the farmer, and an aggressor, the British Hudson's Bay Company, by extension. It allowed Harney and others to frame the complex, boring issue of treaty interpretation into a simple, emotional story. American settler rights being violated by arrogant British interests on American soil, or what they claimed was American soil.
So it personalized the conflict, made it relatable.
Exactly. It bypassed the legal complexities and went straight for gut-level nationalism and property rights. It was easy for newspapers to report, easy for the public to get angry about. Much easier than debating the nuances of the Harrow Strait versus the Rosario Strait. The pig became the perfect, simple symbol for a much larger, more complex geopolitical struggle. He was a conveniently placed scapegoat for those simmering imperial tensions.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, but it's not always just about distraction or scapegoating, is it? You mentioned honor, face, and prestige earlier. That seems huge in some of these cases.
Absolutely fundamental, especially when you look at, say, those medieval Italian city-states or the dynamics between empires. In those contexts, honor and reputation weren't just nice-to-haves, they were critical assets. Losing face could have very real damaging consequences.
Can you expand on that? What did losing face actually mean, practically speaking? For Modena, if they just gave the bucket back, or for Britain, if they ignored Khalid and Zanzibar?
Okay, for a city-state like Bologna, failing to retrieve the bucket, or Modena giving it back too easily, could signal weakness. It might embolden rivals to raid their territory or question their alliances. Merchants might be less willing to trade with a city perceived as unable to defend its own honor. It could affect marriage alliances between noble families. It chipped away at their very identity and standing in a highly competitive world.
So real diplomatic and economic fallout.
Potentially, yes, and for an empire like Britain. Ignoring Khalid's defiance in Zanzibar, even for a short time, could be seen as a crack in their imperial facade. It might encourage anti-colonial sentiment elsewhere. Rival powers might see it as an opportunity to test British resolve. Maintaining prestige, projecting an image of unwavering strength, and the swift punishment of disobedience was crucial for holding the empire together. So the response wasn't just about installing a friendly sultan, it was about sending a message across the entire empire and to other global powers. Don't mess with us.
Right. It's performative, like you said.
Exactly. Which raises that question you touched on. How much of international relations, even today, is still driven by these intangibles: face, prestige, credibility? Nations still go to great lengths to avoid perceived humiliation, to manage optics, to signal resolve. It's often coded in diplomatic language, but the underlying drive to maintain status and avoid perceived weakness is still very much there.
Fascinating. And this ties into the next point, doesn't it? Group identity and in-group cohesion. Conflict seems to bind people together.
It's a classic dynamic. Facing an external threat, or even just a clearly defined other, tends to strengthen the bonds within your own group. Internal squabbles get put aside, at least temporarily. A sense of us versus them becomes much sharper.
Like rallying around the flag.
Precisely. Social psychologists like Gordon Allport studied this extensively. How easily humans form in-groups and out-groups, and how quickly tension can escalate sometimes, starting with just negative talk, then discrimination, then potentially violence. And that small, trivial pretext we keep talking about, the pig, the bucket, the football game, it becomes an incredibly powerful symbol for rallying the in-group.
How so?
It provides a concrete focus for shared identity and shared grievance. They insulted us by stealing our bucket. They disrespected our nation during the match. They are encroaching on our land with their pig. It simplifies the world into us, the virtuous aggrieved, and them, the hostile, transgressing. It draws people together against that common enemy, reinforcing who we are by defining who we are not.
So it's not just about the object or the event itself, but the meaning we pour into it, how it activates our sense of belonging and loyalty.
Exactly right. The object becomes loaded with symbolic meaning, representing the group, its honor, its territory, its identity. And when that symbol is perceived to be under attack, the group cohesion kicks in strongly. It's a powerful mobilizer.
Okay, and the last driver you mentioned, ritualized violence and spectacle. You said some of these felt like performances.
Yes, many of them, especially things like the Anglo-Zanzibar War, or even maybe aspects of the Pastry War's naval actions, have a strong element of performance. They weren't necessarily aimed at total conquest or annihilation. Often, they were about making a statement.
What kind of statement?
A statement of power. A demonstration of force capability. A short, sharp, punitive expedition designed to punish a perceived transgression and deter future ones. The spectacle of the bombardment in Zanzibar, the sheer speed and overwhelming force, was the message. It performed British authority for everyone to see. Zanzibaris, other colonial subjects, rival European powers. It reinforced the existing power structure through a dramatic, violent display.
So less about achieving a specific military objective and more about reinforcing a political reality through a kind of dangerous theater.
In many cases, yes. It's about showing who's boss, who holds the monopoly on decisive violence, and the consequences of challenging that. A very public, often brutal, performance of power.
Wow. Those historical performances of power are quite something. But what's really striking is how these same underlying dynamics, scapegoating, honor, group identity, even spectacle, haven't really gone away. They just look different now, don't they? We see these echoes in the present all the time.
We absolutely do. The technology changes, the context shifts, but the fundamental human and political mechanisms, they persist.
Okay, let's talk about that. Media and symbolism in the digital age. You mentioned viral videos earlier. How does this play out now?
Well, the speed and scale are just amplified enormously, aren't they? In the past, news of the stolen bucket might take days or weeks to spread, relying on messengers or printed pamphlets. Today, a video clip, a photo, a tweet, a hashtag, it can go global in minutes.
And ignite outrage just as fast.
Exactly. A seemingly minor incident captured on video, maybe a border skirmish, police action, a controversial statement, could become an instant international flashpoint. It follows that same old pattern. Symbolic trigger taps into identity politics and emotions, leads to incredibly rapid political mobilization, online and offline.
So think about a viral social media post stirring up trouble between nations or groups. That's the modern equivalent of the pig war trigger, just on digital steroids.
In essence, yes. The mechanism using a potent symbol to rally an in-group and vilify an out-group is remarkably similar. Digital media just provides a much bigger, faster, and often less moderated stage for these dramas. Information and misinformation spreads like wildfire.
Okay, what about those low-level asymmetric conflicts? We don't see declared wars over pigs much, but we see other kinds of ongoing friction.
Right. Think about things like persistent fishing disputes, not unlike the cod wars happening right now in various parts of the world. Or arguments over drilling rights or cyber attacks or trade wars fought with tariffs and sanctions instead of cannons.
So modern versions of the pig war or cod wars, but maybe less likely to involve actual shooting.
Often, yes, they're limited, often symbolic conflicts designed to assert rights or pressure rivals without escalating to full-blown war. International law, diplomatic channels, global organizations, they play a much bigger role now in trying to contain these things, to manage the escalation. But the underlying tensions over resources, territory, or influence are still there.
So the battleground shifts maybe to cyberspace or trade courts, but the game of asserting interests through these limited, sometimes symbolic confrontations continues.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is watching how international law and diplomacy try to keep pace, trying to put guardrails on these new forms of conflict, even as the fundamental drivers persist.
And that brings us back to the football war lesson and resource scarcity and migration. That feels incredibly relevant today.
Hugely relevant. The football war was such a stark example of how sport, something supposedly separate from politics, became the flashpoint because of those deep underlying structural problems. Land pressure in El Salvador, migration into Honduras, economic inequality, weak political institutions.
The game just brought it all to a head.
It divided the spark, the nationalistic fervor. Today, you see similar dynamics everywhere. Tensions over migration, often fueled by climate change, driving people from their homes, or economic desperation, or political instability. These tensions can easily turn symbolic events, maybe a dispute at a border crossing, an argument over water rights, even inflammatory rhetoric into major crises, especially when combined with competition for scarce resources.
So again, the specific trigger might seem small or unrelated, but if those underlying pressures of population stress, resource competition, and inequality are there,
then almost anything can become the spark. The lesson from the football war is potent. When people are struggling for basic needs, land, livelihood, a sense of belonging, societal nerves are raw. It doesn't take much to ignite conflict. The game itself wasn't the problem. It was the magnifying glass, showing us those incredibly deep stress points.
Wow. Okay, so understanding these patterns is crucial, which means we also need to be critical of the simple stories, the myths that often grow up around these events. Let's unpack some of those narratives.
Good idea, because the popular versions often miss the crucial context.
Okay, big one. Myth versus reality, the pig war, the simple story. They almost went to war because of a pig.
Right. And the reality, as we've discussed, is so much more complex. The pig was the catalyst, the immediate trigger, yes. But the real causes were those deep-seated issues. The ambiguous border definition from the Oregon Treaty, years of competing settlement claims by Americans and the British Hudson's Bay Company, and that potent mix of national pride and imperial ambition on both sides.
The pig didn't cause the tension, it just brought it to a head.
Exactly. It was the match thrown onto the powder keg that had been filling up for over a decade. Focusing only on the pig completely misses the crucial geopolitical context, the long history of diplomatic wrangling over the Pacific Northwest. Historians emphasize the treaty language, the company's role, the strategic importance of the islands. The pig is just a footnote, albeit a memorable one.
Okay. What about myth versus reality? The Emu War. The myth, the Australian army lost a war to birds. How ridiculous.
Yeah, that's the common takeaway. And while the outcome was certainly ineffective and, let's face it, pretty comical,
Right.
the reality is it wasn't just some random silly idea. It was framed as a serious policy response to a genuine agricultural crisis. Remember, those farmers were desperate. Their livelihoods were being destroyed during the Depression. The government felt pressure to act.
So it was a legitimate attempt to solve a problem, even if the method was flawed.
Exactly. The fiasco part really highlights the military's logistical limits when faced with an unconventional problem like controlling a massive, mobile wildlife population. It also underscores the real political and economic pressures faced by rural communities. Dismissing it as purely ridiculous overlooks the genuine suffering of the farmers and the government's, however clumsy, attempt to address it. It was less war and more pest control gone wrong, driven by real economic distress.
That context is important. And then there's this broader point, a lesser-known truth, the funny versus the fatal. We can find humor in the triggers, but the consequences were often anything but funny.
This is absolutely critical. It raises that ethical question. How do we talk about these events without trivializing the real human suffering involved? Because even if the stark seems absurd, the fire can be devastating.
Like the football war, triggered by soccer matches, but thousands died or were displaced.
Exactly. Or think about the economic impact of the cod wars on fishing families and communities in both Iceland and the UK. Or the long-term diplomatic fallout from incidents like the Pastry War. These strange conflicts often had very serious, lasting negative consequences. Displacement, casualties, economic ruin, political instability. It's vital to remember that human cost. When we analyze these wars, we have to hold the absurdity of the trigger in one hand and the gravity of the consequences in the other.
Absolutely. Finding that balance is key.
Yeah.
Okay, to get an even deeper understanding, let's put on that scholar's lens. How do different academic fields look at these strange wars?
Each field brings a slightly different perspective, which is really useful for getting a rounded picture.
Let's start with international relations scholars. You mentioned diversionary war theory earlier. Can you recap that?
Sure. The core idea in IR is that sometimes leaders facing domestic problems, maybe a bad economy, political scandals, social unrest, might be tempted to provoke or escalate an external conflict.
Why? To distract the public.
Partly, yes, to distract, but also to rally support, rally around the flag effect, increase national cohesion, and shift the focus away from their internal failings onto an external enemy. It's a way to potentially boost their own legitimacy and power.
But you said it's contested.
It is. It's an influential theory, and you can definitely find historical cases that seem to fit the pattern. But critics point out it's hard to prove conclusively that a leader's motive was diversion. And there are many cases where leaders facing crises don't start external conflicts. So it's considered a possible explanation in some context, but not a universal law. It's one tool political scientists use to analyze state behavior.
Okay. How about social psychologists? What's their angle?
They focus more on the group dynamics and individual psychology. Building on work by people like Gordon Allport, they look at intergroup prejudice, stereotyping, and how powerful symbols, what Allport called labels of primary potency, can trigger strong emotional responses.
So how does a pig or a bucket become one of those potent labels?
Because it gets imbued with meaning related to group identity. The pig stops being just an animal and becomes a symbol of them encroaching on us, or them disrespecting us. The bucket isn't just wood, it's our civic honor being stolen by them. These symbols tap into deep-seated feelings of loyalty, pride, fear, and anger directed towards the outgroup. Social psychologists study how these emotions can be manipulated and how quickly they can escalate from prejudice to discrimination to conflict.
So it's really about the meaning we attach to the symbol, driven by our group identities and feelings about the other.
Precisely. The object itself is secondary. It's the symbolic weight it carries within that specific intergroup context that gives it power. And finally, you have the historians. What's their main focus? Historians tend to drill down into the specific structural context of each case. They emphasize the long-term factors, the underlying economics, the imperial rivalries, the specific political culture, like those Italian city-state feuds, the demographic pressures like migration patterns. For historians, the absurd trigger is often just the tip of the iceberg.
A symptom, not the disease.
Exactly. So a historian looking at the Pig War focuses first on the Oregon Treaty's ambiguity, the Hudson's Bay Company's role, the westward expansion. The pig is just the final, almost accidental spark that ignites that pre-existing tinder. They look for the deeper systemic causes that made the conflict possible, even likely.
It's fascinating how these different lenses, political science, psychology, history, they don't contradict each other, do they? They seem to add layers.
They really complement each other. Political science looks at state strategies, psychology at group emotions, history at the deep context. Together, they give us a much richer, multi-layered understanding of why these strange wars happened and what they tell us about human conflict more broadly.
That multi-layered view is exactly what we need. And it also reminds us to consider the cultural nuances and ethical considerations. How a society reacts isn't universal. It depends heavily on the time and place, right?
Absolutely. The cultural context is everything.
So let's take medieval Europe, like with the War of the Oaken Bucket. What was specific about that culture that made a bucket-related war possible?
In that specific context of medieval Italy, you had intense city-state rivalry, powerful family factions, Guelphs, Ghibellines, and extremely strong codes of honor and civic pride. Violence, including ritualized feuds and raids, was a more accepted part of political life. So a symbolic theft, a public insult like stealing the bucket, was perceived as a direct attack on the city's honor, demanding a forceful, public, potentially violent response to restore face. It fit within their framework of acceptable political behavior, strange as it seems to us.
Okay. And shifting to imperial contexts, the Anglo-Zanzibar War, the Pastry War, what defined that environment?
There, the dominant logic was about maintaining imperial control and prestige. Empires often used disproportionate force in response to perceived challenges, however minor. It wasn't just about protecting specific commercial interests, though that mattered. It was fundamentally about demonstrating unwavering authority and deterring any future resistance, both within the colony and among rival powers. An unchallenged slight could be seen as weakness, inviting more trouble. So swift, overwhelming force was often the default response to uphold imperial dominance.
And now, democratic modern states, how has the context changed? We have international law, media, public opinion.
It's definitely changed the landscape. Modern states, especially democracies, generally face more internal and external scrutiny. Mass media reports events globally, publics often demand justifications for military action, and international organizations and legal frameworks exist to mediate disputes. Diplomacy and arbitration are much more common paths than immediate military escalation over minor incidents.
But does that mean these dynamics are gone?
Not entirely. That's the catch. While the constraints are greater, the power of symbolic incidents, amplified by fast media and online outrage, can still create immense pressure for action. Viral videos or inflammatory rhetoric can still escalate tensions incredibly quickly, sometimes bypassing those slower diplomatic processes. So the pattern of symbolic triggers igniting strong reactions persists, even within a more complex legal and media environment.
That persistence of the human element is key. Which brings us back to those crucial ethical questions, particularly about laughing at victims. We need to tread carefully here.
Extremely carefully. It's so easy to focus on the absurdity of the trigger, the pig, the bucket, the emus, and make light of the entire conflict. But, as we've stressed, real people often suffered and died in these wars. The football war is a prime example. The trigger seems almost trivial, but the human cost was immense.
So ethical storytelling requires what?
It requires balancing the intellectual curiosity about the strange trigger with genuine respect for the human consequences. We need to acknowledge the absurdity where it exists because it's part of what makes these cases revealing, but never let that overshadow or trivialize the suffering, the displacement, the loss of life. It's about seeking understanding, not cheap laughs at the expense of victims.
A very important distinction. And finally, pulling all this together, what are the core lessons for policymakers today? What should they take away from the pig war or the cod wars?
I think the biggest lesson is, don't dismiss the seemingly trivial. An embarrassing pretext, a silly incident, can often mask deep-seated legitimate grievances. Ignoring the underlying structural problems, the border disputes, the resource scarcity, the economic inequality, the historical animosities, is incredibly dangerous.
Because just dealing with the surface incident, the spark, doesn't fix the underlying problem.
Exactly. You might put out the small fire caused by the pig incident, but if the tinder of the border dispute remains dry, another spark will eventually ignite it again. Treating only the symptom invites recurrence, potentially on a larger scale. This really raises that critical question for today. Are we getting any better at looking past the immediate, often sensationalized, trigger the modern pig or bucket in the headlines to see and address the deeper issues? Or are we still too easily distracted by the absurdity, missing the real dangers lurking beneath? Policymakers need that foresight.
That's a really sobering thought to grapple with. Okay, as we start to wrap up this deep dive, let's just do a quick critical reflection. What have we gained, and what pitfalls do we need to watch out for?
Good way to synthesize.
So first, the strength of studying these wars. What's the real value here beyond just interesting stories?
I think there are three main strengths. First, they vividly reveal the mechanics of conflict escalation. How symbols work, how identity gets mobilized, how political signaling happens in practice. They strip it down almost. Second, they're incredibly powerful teaching tools. The memorable hooks pig, bucket, emu make complex ideas about structural causes and political dynamics much easier to grasp and remember.
They stick in your mind.
Exactly. And third, they kind of humanize diplomacy and conflict. They show how seemingly small decisions, individual actions, or even just misunderstandings can spiral into major international incidents. It highlights the fragility and the importance of careful communication and understanding context.
Okay, but there are potential downsides too, right? Weaknesses and limits in focusing on the strange.
Definitely. The main risk is that by overemphasizing the humorous or bizarre pretext, we might unintentionally downplay the real violence, the suffering, the long-term harm caused. We risk trivializing serious events. Another potential issue is exoticizing, framing these conflicts as something weird that other people did in the past, rather than recognizing the universal human and political patterns that are still relevant everywhere today. We need to avoid creating a simplistic us, rational versus them, irrational narrative.
Good point. Which leads to the dangers to avoid. It really is a fine line, isn't it? Balancing the intrigue with the seriousness.
It's a very fine line. The biggest danger is simplistic storytelling that feeds misinformation suggesting the pig caused the crisis, full stop. Or using comedic tones insensitively, which can dehumanize the victims and disrespect the real tragedy involved. We have to be rigorous with context and maintain empathy, using the absurdity to illuminate the underlying seriousness, not obscure it.
Well put. Okay, so we've journeyed from pigs and buckets to emus and football games, uncovering the hidden springs of conflict beneath the strange surfaces.
Quite the tour.
It really hammers home that these strangest wars aren't just historical footnotes to chuckle at. They're powerful microcosms, aren't they? Showing us how humans turn symbols into political power, how societies react under pressure.
They reveal so much about how ambiguous borders, competition for resources, bruised national honor, economic desperation, or even just leaders looking for advantage can turn tiny sparks into these huge fires.
And the scary part is, in our hyper-connected world, the potential for those sparks to ignite is maybe even greater. A single image, one incident, can become a global symbol overnight, carrying immense geopolitical weight.
Which is why understanding these historical examples is so vital. Understanding the past's pig, bucket, and pastry scandals helps us decode modern crises. Hopefully, it helps us see past the surface trigger and recognize the deeper issues before they escalate.
So the final thought for you, our listeners. As you look at today's headlines, especially the ones that seem maybe a bit strange or disproportionate, ask yourself, what pig or bucket might be hiding underneath? What deeper story is waiting to be unpacked?
Keep digging. Keep questioning. The connections between the past and our present are always there, often in surprising ways.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.